Welcome to Season 2 of the Project Hope podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer. As many of you know, I am a cult survivor myself. For anyone interested, you can hear the story of how I got in and how I got out in Season 1, Episodes 1 and 2. The beginning of this year, 2023, actually marks my 11 years of being out, and I am so super grateful for the ways my life has unfolded since. I now work with survivors of coercive control, and I'm going to take a moment here to define this term, as one of my heart's desires is to help society at large better understand coercive control in cases that are not just culty, but across the globe. I view coercive control as a social issue. It's at the heart of cases where women and girls are murdered. We find coercive control in one-to-one relationships that are intimate, in gangs, sex trafficking, and cults of all types. I have a master's in the psychology of coercive control, and I'm just beginning a new element of my career as an expert witness for legal cases that involve coercive control. As a certified trauma professional, I work with survivors. I'm especially excited to be offering a group survivor program for cult and religious abuse recovery. So this is not a support group, but rather a healing program. It's based on my certification in the incredible work of Dr. Jilly Jenkinson, who gathered decades of research on survivors to create a body of work that I would consider to be the most comprehensive and flexible approach I've come across in this field. We will meet every other week for 6 months, and registration will open in February of 2023 for those interested. Lastly, I am also a research associate at Salford University and explore topics related to coercive control. So let's jump back into a basic understanding of coercive control before I introduce the next episode. Coercive control is a strategic pattern of behavior designed to exploit, control, create dependency, and dominate. The victim's everyday existence is micromanaged, and their space for action, as well as potential as a human being, is limited and controlled by the abuser. Initially, the victim may be drawn into the relationship with love bombing and charm. Then gaslighting, isolation, economic control, and financial abuse can take place alongside rules and regulations that are gradually introduced over time and change at the whim of the abuser. The victim knows there are consequences if rules are broken, and they apply to the victim rather than the perpetrator, creating a double standard. Over time, coercively controlling behavior erodes the victim's sense of self, their confidence, self-esteem, agency, and autonomy. The abuser creates an unreal world of contradiction, confusion, and fear. It may be helpful to know that 51% of victims do not even know that they are being abused, manipulated, and controlled. Coercive control correlates significantly to serious harm, and in many cases, in intimate partner violence, it precedes homicide. These can be difficult topics to grapple with, so I truly hope that this podcast helps to protect you and those you love with helpful voices and information. If you appreciate the podcast, please let us know by subscribing and comment with kindness. And always think critically, trust your intuition, and be free. Dr. Tamara MC is a cult, child marriage, and human trafficking survivor. She advocates worldwide for girls and women to live free from gender-based violence. Her PhD is in applied linguistics, and she researches how language manipulates vulnerable populations. She's published in prestigious outlets such as the New York Times, New York Magazine, and Salon. She's currently revising her debut memoir, Child Bride, My Marriage at 12. You'll hear us refer to this project during our two-part interview, and I certainly hope that I get to promote her memoir as it comes out. Tamara's story is just incredible. You will hear about her life in a Sufi-based cult, a group she became part of as a young child with a father who was devoted to the group or mission of the group. I feel grateful to Tamara for sharing so much of her life with us, as you will hear her refer to different life phases, the internal division that going between mom and dad caused her, the devoted servitude she experienced with the cult leader and his family, now acknowledged as labor trafficking, and her marriage as a child, and all of the confusing messages and experiences surrounding this. Tamara's story is one that I certainly view with deep respect and, well, triumph, frankly, as you will hear the incredible things Tamara has accomplished and the ways she currently uses her words and voice to advocate for others and make our world a better place. We have links in the show notes to all things Tamara MC, PhD. Please be sure to visit her website because it also has some of her published works, amidst which is her article in Ms. Magazine about the cult she grew up in, and her Motherwell article about girls staying sweet, a reference I'm sure many of you will recognize. Without further delay, please welcome Tamara MC for part one of our two-part discussion. So welcome to the Project Hope podcast, Tamara MC, PhD. So happy to have you with us. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Jennifer, for bringing me on to your very special podcast.
Thanks, Tamara. So I thought for the audience, we could just kind of ground people in one of the conversations that Tamara and I had for the audience prior to this interview was just kind of the acknowledgement, Tamara's story is out there. You just had an amazing interview on A Little Bit Culty. So people can go to other sources to kind of get your full story. But just for this audience, Tamara, if you don't mind kind of grounding people into what the culty experience was, maybe even just like a little chronology to bring us there, since you were quite young.
Sure, yes. So my father joined this community, and I'm going to use community, cult, commune interchangeably, but he joined this community when I was 5 years old. So that was in the late 1970s, just to ground you in the time frame. At that point, my mother and father were together, but my mother chose not to join this group. So I ended up splitting time between my mother and my father. My father left Arizona, where we were living at that point, and I would spend 4 months with my dad. He moved to Texas eventually. We were a very nomadic community and traveled, but eventually we would settle in Texas for quite a while. And I would go between my mom and my dad. My mom lived a more traditional life, so I attended a regular public school, a lower to middle class public school. But then in the commune, I was with a whole bunch of children who were homeschooled. And while I was on the commune, I was also homeschooled. And homeschool really at that time didn't mean like schooling in mathematics and English. It was really schooling in religious studies. So we were studying scripture, we were studying language, we were studying prophets and whatever had to do with religious texts. So that was kind of the beginning of how I grew into this community when I was 5.
Wow. So, and I'm curious. I have heard people talk about, especially in divorced families, where they're almost kind of living in two different worlds, going between the two families. Do you mind sharing a little bit about, like, do you relate to that kind of living in two worlds, or were you feeling more attached to one world after a period of time?
Yeah, so I was definitely living between two worlds, and my identity was further splintering as each month passed because my mom and my father lived so differently. And my mother was a liberal 1960s hippie, a feminist, and was living a really carefree life. And that's how my dad was living before they separated. And then when my father joined this new community, it was incredibly conservative and probably the exact opposite of feminist, so very patriarchal and very controlling, whereas my mother believed in freedom and independence. My father's community was about control and power. So they were two very, very different communities with very different rules. So I had to go between them, and I made it look very fluid, as if it just happened, but it was incredibly difficult. And that being said, like, even though I was living in two very different worlds, my father's community had a lot more force to it because it was a lot more verbal. There were a lot more teachings that eventually I just moved much closer to his teachings than to my mother's, because my mother wasn't telling me be like this. She was just very free with me and allowing me to be who I was choosing to be. So with my father, I was told exactly how to dress, how to speak, what to study, all, everything within my life was being controlled. So I did sway towards his teachings very gradually.
Oh, and interesting that it was gradual. I also just am considering your age and growing up in that way, and just the desire that so many of us, especially I think those who join communities like later on in life, who join by choice, that there's this fundamental need for certainty, that these groups answer to in the dictatorialness of it all. And I've always wondered, if you're a younger age, how that might affect or influence a child in terms of that idea of them independently kind of gravitating toward certainty and adults really knowing everything versus something that feels more carefree, kind of like the spirit of a child. I don't know, just a contemplation kind of.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, like when I use the word gradual, it's not like the slow gradual. It was just, I think, like, actually from the get-go, I kind of bought into it as well with my dad when I was 5 years old, because I was love bombed immediately. I was told I was the most special child. I was told I was beautiful. I was renamed. I was no longer living by the name that my mother and father gave me when I was born. So I had a completely different name. And so all of that happened very quickly, that I did very clearly become an entirely new identity. So when I say gradual, it was that I think that I was still very connected to my mother originally, but then it slowly, like, my father would tell me, or I should say, when I say my father, I also mean just the community in general, the women, the men, the leaders, would tell me that my mother was living in sin. My mother wasn't a believer, and all of these things that I began to believe them because I believed that we were the ones going to heaven, that we were the ones with the truth. And if my mother wasn't following, which they believed that basically she should have done, and because she didn't follow the community, she was going to go to hell, that I was really afraid of going to hell myself, because that's what I was being taught, that I did move towards towards that way of thinking just to save myself.
Yes, of course. Of course. And as a child, you innocently believe as well. That's why it's like in these situations, there so needs to be conversations around the kids. Okay, so move us along a little in the timeline.
Sure. So we had three leaders, and the first leader was from England and ended up returning, but we had a new leader who came, and he had a lot of money. So he built a huge compound in Texas. And it was then that we moved there, that I moved there with my father. Also, by the time I was 6, my father had remarried another woman who was also part of the community. So I had a stepmother very quickly, and she had 4 children of her own. So I had 4 step siblings. So I grew up with them. So I went from being an only child to being one of 5. So that was also a big change in my life. And I was then sharing rooms with them. I was sharing everything with them, in addition to sharing everything with the other children in the community. So when this new structure was built, we moved there, and the structure was in the hill country of Texas at that point. I believe it was like 150 to a 250 acre farm. And there was really only one way in and one way out. And the nearest town was probably a 25-minute drive, and there weren't cars in the community. There was maybe 1 or 2 cars that were for the men to go shopping, because they'd have to go into town and go shopping. And so we didn't really leave as soon as I would arrive. I'd come in on the airplane the day after school finished, and then I would leave the day before school would begin. So I would be there for summers and Christmases. So just over 4 months of the year. And that was also, I think, why my identity was bouncing, because it wasn't as if I was staying with my father for a full year, for example, and then going back to my mother. Just as I would get comfortable after 3.5, 4 months, I would then be going to a new environment. And whereas like my mother was stable, I went to the same school, I lived in the same neighborhood. When I'd visit my father, he'd live in a new place. There would be new people, there would be new rules. And so I was constantly having to learn like what are the new rules? Who are the new people? Who is the new leader? Because the leader was also changing. And let me think. So after we got to the new property, it seemed as if like things were going to settle down somewhat, because this was now built for us. It was built exactly how the leader wanted it to be built. And so it seemed like it was then going to become stable.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also a very contained, controlled environment, isn't it?
Yes, it was very, very contained. And yes, like all the children were being schooled on property. The men were not working outside of the property. And of course, nor were the women. All of the births were taking place on property. The women would suddenly become midwives without any training. They also became the doctors of the community. So we didn't go to hospitals. We didn't go for any sort of health care. And so, yes, and there was absolutely no outside access for us.
Yeah. And can I ask about the relationship with the siblings? Was that a positive? Was it what kind of happened there for you?
Yeah, so it was very positive, but it was also very difficult because I was having to learn so many new things that now having to learn being one of many was a big change in my life. And I had a brother who was 2 years old when my father and stepmother got married. And so he was really young, and he was just like in those terrible twos. And I had never been around like a little boy, much less a little boy who was really wild. And my grandmother was so sweet because she used to send me with vitamins when I would go to my dad's, and they were the, oh my God, I can't even think of the name right now. Oh, they were the chewable vitamins. Flintstones. Yes. She would send me with my Flintstones vitamins to my dad. And I would I would promised her that I would take one every day. But I had this new little brother. And as soon as I would get there and he saw my bottle of vitamins, he would like eat them several a day. And so I wasn't even able to take my vitamins because he would like steal them. And because we weren't allowed to have sugar in our community. So for him, it was candy. And he was so excited to kind of have these vitamins. I also had a sister who was just a year and a half younger than me, and we were complete opposite. She was very rebellious and she talked back and just had so much attitude. And I was very quiet and very obedient. And so I didn't quite know what to think of her, but she always made me feel so comfortable that very quickly we became best friends immediately.
Sweet. Yeah, it's these situations are just so layered. I think of how so often it is in some of the relationships, even though, groups try to break up relationships, there also tend to be these sort of magical moments of relief in particular friendships or relationships. I'm glad you had that.
No, absolutely. Like my sister is probably the reason I survived because she was just so tough and she just got the two of us through things.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yes.
Okay, so then we enter into this experience where one of the group leaders, well, you're entering into adulthood, shall we say.
The summer that the commune was built was like the summer after sixth grade for me. So I was 11. And when I returned the summer after seventh grade, I assumed I would be returning to the same place. However, I spent one night there, and then the leader who lived separately, he lived about an hour away from the actual property, and he lived on what we called the hill, and he lived there with his 3 wives, and he had multiple children at the time. And he told my father that he wanted me to live with him for the summer. So just as I was so excited to see my sister and she was so excited to see me, the next morning I was told that I was going to be leaving. And I then was brought an hour away. I was dropped off. My father dropped me off at the leader's second wife, at the second wife's house, and she had 4 children under the age of 6. I didn't know why I was there. I was told that I was there because I was special and because she really, really liked me and wanted me to live with her. And my father was told that I was going to get special teachings by the leader because I was going to be living in his house with him. And that was really the summer that changed everything, other than like the summer when I was 5 years old and my father joined this community. So those were the 2 big moments in my life.
And Tamara, when I think about this and your experience of kind of being told that, you're special and you sort of have this honored privilege of being at this home, in your young little mind, were you actually excited or were you already feeling a little worried because you wouldn't then be with your sister and your family?
I was not at all excited. I was really sad to be leaving my sister because she was my safety at that point, and I didn't know where I was going. I had never been with these people. I'd never spent the night with them, so I didn't know them. They weren't part of the community because they lived so separately that I didn't have access to them. So they weren't like somebody that we were eating meals with or anything. They were just really strangers. And this was like the leader who was so high up that even when I did see him, I would be bowing to him and I would be, as soon as he would walk into the room, everybody would have to stand immediately. So there were all these rules around this person. And nobody got near the leader except for like a couple of like his head henchmen, like right at the, right at the very top. So it's not as if I, as a little girl, had ever got close to him. So I didn't understand why I was being sent. And I was scared because already I was always scared every time I went to my dad's because it was so unexpected. And I didn't want to leave my mom's. I was always nervous. And then like not only not being with my dad, but now I was in a completely new place that I had never visited before.
Oh my gosh, it's terrifying. It's like, and then just knowing a little about, the actual situation there where you're basically, free labor and not treated as a part of the family, really. How terrifying. And what age are you around this time?
So I had just completed 7th grade and I was 12 years old.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
So it was just my first year of middle school. And yes, and so I was there. I was so quickly thrown into everything. And I was there to take care of these 4 little children under 6 years old. And I was left alone in a room from before sunrise until after sunset. And I was supposed to make sure that all 4 of these children were safe and happy. So that was my entire summer, was taking care of these kids.
In a room.
In a room, yes, by myself.
Wow, that is so intense. And also just considering your background, that you had been a single child. So that must have been especially confusing. It's like you haven't even been around really raising another child, unless maybe that happened with your father and his new wife. But oh my goodness, what responsibility. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, once my father did join the community, like after I was the only child for quite some time, but by the time I was, I don't know, maybe a couple years later, there were more children in the community. And then I did have my step siblings. So I had become used to being around young children, and we were kind of taking care of them, but not in that same way that I was now alone taking care of these children, these new children.
Yeah.
And the youngest one was 6 months old. So just a baby.
Gosh. Whoa. So were you actually responsible for the food and everything?
So the baby was still nursing. So the mom would come and nurse and then leave. So I wasn't responsible for feeding the baby, but I was responsible for feeding the other children.
Wow. That is some serious responsibility.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So that was kind of how the summer began. But then, the second thing that happened within the first week or so was that the adopted son of the leader snuck into my room and began molesting me at that point. But because we were part of purity culture, he said that he had to marry me. And so within that first week at midnight, like after I had been working all day, he did a marriage ceremony and married himself to me that night. And so now I was also married to somebody also after when I was 12 years old.
Yeah. It's so intense. And did you have any sense of how the community accepted that, or how your father did? Because I wondered about, like, it was legitimately formal and actually binding within that group. I mean, just to let the audience know, it means that you are married. And I think, as you've explained, there's kind of a difference between a forever marriage and not, but.
Right. Yeah. So I was married in what was called a temporary marriage, which means that somebody is married for a specific amount of time. Within a temporary marriage, the person, I'm not using the word man because it's not even only men, it could be even younger boys. they do not have to support the girl or the woman. So that's one of the reasons. But the main reason to have a temporary marriage is so that this person can be intimate with the girl or the woman. And that if they are to have a baby, that it would not be considered illegitimate.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So within the community, was it okay that this young man independently made that decision with you?
I'm not sure because the community didn't know. It was a secret marriage. So my father didn't know because he wasn't visiting, or if he was there rarely. And I don't even really remember him being there too much. And the leader didn't know. Like, I was told to keep it a secret. So it really was initially a secret marriage.
Oh, and when did that change that it came out? Because you guys were obviously together for quite a while.
So it came out in different waves and to different people and to different parts of the community. It wasn't, there wasn't the grand announcement that happened.
Yeah.
It just slowly became known to different people.
Yeah.
It was just on such a different time frame. So it's really hard to say. But by the time I was 14, we had a third leader that had come in. And with this new leader, child marriage became very prevalent. So most girls were being married off by 14. 14 was the year that basically the community was told that all the girls had to be married by, because already a girl was getting too old by 14. So child marriages, like mine at that point, was just kind of not a big deal because most of the girls were being married into these situations.
Yes. Wow. Did that create a deeper camaraderie between you and the other girls, or did it affect relationships between the women?
Oh, yes. We all were very close throughout this because we were all struggling. I mean, the young girls were struggling. So we would, whenever we could, whenever the husband was away outside of the room, we would all come together and whisper and talk and like tell each other our stories. And so we became incredibly close during this time.
Wow.
But also, like, the girls, I'm using this in air quotes, but they really wanted to be married quickly and young, because the girls who weren't married were in charge of all of the work. So the unmarried girls had to do all the childcare, all the cooking, and all the cleaning within the community. So once a girl got married, she no longer had to do that because she was now considered a wife and a woman. And so her status was instantly elevated. So girls were trying to get married so that they could get out of our horrendous workloads, which were so difficult. And I didn't have a forever marriage, so I was still considered like a single girl. So I was still working. My girlfriends had forever marriages, so they were able to like get out of it, but I wasn't. So that was one of the key differences, is I still had to do all of the work.
Oh my gosh. And how confusing as well. You know, I just keep returning to imagining at the age that you're at, processing everything that's going on, and just how incredibly confusing it is, you know, to be told that you're the special one, to be one of the first kids of the community, which is typically an elevated status of some sort, to be at the, you know, leader's home and actually living there and in that environment and having everybody kind of revering that. But then it's like, you're married, but you don't have the forever marriage. You're literally taking care of a brood of children. You know, it's so did that arrangement continue when you would go back and forth in years to come?
Yeah. So I think it was very purposeful that I wasn't given the forever marriage. The leader eventually found out about everything, and he would not allow us to get forever married. He made it very clear that we weren't allowed to. And so in that way, he was still able to keep control over me, because as a young girl, you have what is called, I know the word in a different language, I'm trying to think of it in English, but you have the person who's in charge of you. So you go from, for example, your father's house to your husband's house. So as a girl, you're never in charge of your body or your choice or your decisions. It's always first your father and then your husband. But for me, it became my father, and then it became the leader. But neither my father nor the leader wanted to give up their sort of power over me, that they did not allow me to have this forever marriage, because then they would be giving it away to my husband. And so there was really this battle between all three of them for who was in charge of me. And I was in the middle of these three men who were kind of fighting for who was in charge of me.
Wow. Well, and I think in this dynamic as well, Tamara, about the leader, and just how it strikes me as so profoundly kind of bizarre and odd that he would keep you there, keep you close, keep you kind of in the family, but not. And yeah, I just wondered about that.
Yeah. And I mean, at the time, I didn't think anything of it, but as the years pass and I think about it more, and I don't have, I mean, maybe there is evidence that I still am not like willing to accept, but he probably was grooming me for himself or his wife throughout all those years. The leader was, and he wasn't willing to let me go. I mean, as a woman now, and I think about, why was I as a young girl living in this house? It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
And why was I connected to the leader all these years? Like, I stayed with him for 8 years, and I was just part of this family for that long. And it's just odd, because no other person was allowed into this family except for me. There weren't any other people, like women, girls, men, like it was just me.
Wow. Yeah. And was there, also in your acknowledgement of kind of this power struggle between these three men, was there ever a discussion or an attempt to return back to your family unit? Or was that just, once it happened, it's like you get to receive this amazing gift and it's this elevated status. And so it's not even considered that you would certainly ask to go back to the family, right? Because that would be a no-no.
So it does get complicated. The second leader who I was living with would eventually leave the US. He'd have to flee the US for issues with the government. And so he was no longer living in Texas. So then when I would return to Texas after that, I would be living with my dad. So I was staying with my dad and the family in the commune. And my husband also moved internationally. So our relationship was happening through letters mostly, although he visited me sometimes. So that was kind of, between like 13 to 16, I was, kind of back and forth between all three of these people. I was seeing them in different ways, all three of these men. Then when I was 16, I graduated early from high school, and I went to live with my father full time. So I was now living in Texas full time. So I wasn't going between Arizona and Texas anymore. I was full time living on the commune. And all these years, the leader was trying to get me to live abroad with him. And he was like waiting for me to graduate. So the reason I was graduating early was so that I could do this. And then just pretty much soon after I turned 16, I went to live with the leader internationally. So I was living with him again.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
How intense, Tamara. You're 16 years old, it's really how wild. Okay. And of course, the community's perception of him is completely intact because there's some message, of course, to the group about why he had to flee and, that he's not in the wrong, right? So everybody's still in reverence of him. That didn't change anything, I assume.
No, that didn't change anything. And he put in charge this new leader who was the third leader who then came in. Or, I mean, there's debate whether or not he put him in charge or this third leader just came in. But we did have a new leader that we were following. So it's not as if we were without a leader. We were never without a leader. There was always somebody on the top. And when I had moved internationally, the second wife had 2 more babies. So when I was living there, I again had a new 6-month-old and a new 2-year-old to take care of. So I was there pretty much doing the exact same thing I did when I was 12, except for, now there were 6 children instead of 4 children.
Oh my gosh. And I hope it was a European country where you at least could understand the language. It's like so many changes. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So how long were you there with them?
Probably a couple of years.
Because this is really the first time now that you're not in school.
Right.
Okay. And what was that experience like, Tamara?
It was so, so difficult because my workload had even increased, which seems impossible. But I was in charge of all of the cooking and all of the entire kitchen. And there, the leader's mother lived there. And then there were always guests, like a sister and his brother. And there were just so many people. And I'd have to serve lunch every day at 3:00. And it was this huge lunch that would take me hours to cook. And then I'd have hours of dishwashing. And so they had hired a nanny who worked 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, I believe. And so the nanny would take care of the baby and the 2-year-old during the day because I was in charge of the kitchen. But as soon as the baby woke up early in the morning, the baby was given to me at 5 a.m. And then as soon as she left at 5 p.m., I was in charge of all of the children again. So I wasn't getting a break at all. And this was 7 days a week. I didn't have a day off, an hour off. I just was working all the time. So I was very, very exhausted.
Wow. And of course, under levels of extraordinary exhaustion and being worked, it's there's just absolutely no space to consider anything really, or to be in tune with your feelings, or it's you're just on autopilot. So when did this kind of scenario change, or how did it change?
So my husband also moved internationally to live with the leader as well. We weren't allowed to live in the same house. It was very clear. I lived in the leader's house with him and the wives and the children. And my husband had to live in another condo that was in a different city. So we weren't even allowed to live together. And the leader would constantly say that we're not allowed to be married forever. We're not allowed to be together in this way. And so it was very complicated like that. My husband at the time also, when he was living in America and I was living internationally, he had stopped writing me, and he had mostly been the person who would send most of the letters. And he was always the one who was getting in touch with me. And so I didn't understand what happened. And so I would write him letters when I was there alone before he had joined me, and he wouldn't tell me what was wrong. So after he did move there, I just begged him. I was please tell me what's wrong. I know something's different. I know something's wrong. And he just told me, he said, I married another woman. And I just all these years that I had waited for us to have this forever marriage, I had given up my whole life to be married to this person. I had graduated high school early so that I could also, it was to be with the leader, but it was also so that I could live with my husband. There were so many things that I had done. And we had grown up in a polygamist cult. So polygamy was very common. And his mother also like had been married in polygamy and had terrible situations and had like multiple kids who most of the adults had these polygamist relationships, including my young friends who I spoke about earlier. They would get married to older men. Like the older men would usually have a first wife who was about their age, and then they would marry a young girl. And then the young girl would have babies with them. And then that man would divorce her. And then she'd be left alone with all of these babies by herself. And then it would be so hard for her to get remarried because she was no longer a virgin per se. These are not my words, of course. And so many girls and women were being left after they had children. So polygamy was something that I had seen that had just destroyed my friends' lives. It had destroyed the women's lives. And it had, my stepmother left her first husband because he had married another woman. And my stepmom then had these 4 kids and a little baby. And the husband said that he preferred the second wife. And there was all these issues. So my stepmother had left that situation and married my father. My father never got married into polygamy. He was probably one of the only men. And so my husband also had a similar situation with his mother, who had been married in polygamy and was left with these children. So both of us knew that we were not going to live in polygamy. That was very clear. So when he came back and told me that he married another woman, that went against every promise that he had made to me.
Oh. And everything having to do with kind of the core safety that you're holding on to, and knowing that you'd be kind of protected from this, the polygamy fallout disasters.
Right. And I don't think I mentioned to your audience, but I was obviously raped in the beginning, with my marriage and all of that, and would continue to be raped. But there was also something that changed in me where I did begin to fall in love with this person because he was all I knew. And I didn't have I had this leader who was just telling me what to do, my dad who was pretty absent. And then I had this person who came into my life who would tell me I was beautiful and I was this and I was that. I didn't even know what beautiful meant. I didn't even notice my looks or anything at that time. But my new husband was making all these promises that we're going to have this amazing life and we're going to have children. Everything that I'd been taught to be was to be a wife and a mother. And he was promising me that that's what we're going to have and that we're going to live within the community. And so I began to build up this dream in my own head that this was the life that I wanted. So by the time 8 years later, when I was 20, I had been, I really thought that I loved this person more than anything. So it was incredibly, incredibly heartbreaking.
Yes. Oh, it's just so complicated, isn't it? The layers. And once again, I just think about, in some ways, as I'm listening to Tamara, I'm having such an appreciation for adaptability, and how we're able to actually tell ourselves something or grow in a certain way to find the love that's there. It's even if it's born out of desperation, it's that's of course where good human nature goes, Yeah. So right. Of course, so this is absolutely heartbreaking, devastating, and also really also you must be thinking, what is the impact on your world now, your life, your plan? It's like the experience of the carpet being pulled out from under you, but you're still in the cult.
Right. And so, I would beg my husband to leave the other woman, and he just became incredibly cold, and he would just say, no, I love her. I will not leave her. And he was very clear that he was not going to leave her and that I was going to have to accept this arrangement. There was no choice. And I just felt so stuck at that point, because the leader still wouldn't allow us to have a forever marriage. So I still couldn't have that. I still was stuck in this house taking care of these kids, and I couldn't leave. And now my husband was there, who I thought was going to rescue me in some way. And now he's telling me that not only does he love another woman, but I think he was so enamored with her that it seemed as if he didn't love me anymore, because, that shine in his eyes that he used to have when he looked at me, it was gone. Like, I could just tell that I was no longer important in his life. Oh. And so I knew that I had lost him, and he would try to convince me, I'm going to be married to both of you. You're going to become best friends. You're going to love her. And he would try to make it sound as if like this was going to be this wonderful new life that like the three of us were going to live together. And I just knew deep down that there was no way I could accept that as my life, that I could not live through that. And also, like, all of this began when I was so young, working for the leader and getting married, that at that point I wasn't able to really understand anything that was happening. But by this point, I was now 20. So I had a different experience. So I was now able to like reevaluate this marriage and think like, what is this? And how am I going to be married like this? Like if he had entered into polygamy with me when I was 12, I'm sure I would have done it, because I wouldn't have even had a choice. I mean, I had no choice. But at 20, I was able to have a little bit more of a choice. And even though I was 20 and I didn't legally, there was nothing keeping me I wasn't like being imprisoned physically, but I was completely imprisoned because I thought that I had to be there. And there was nowhere else on earth I would have rather been than living with the leader and having his special teachings, which really never happened. It was just working. But I thought I was still gaining these, like, I just thought just being like in the same house with him, it's like the energy was like coming into me and I was gaining all of this, and it was just coming through me, even though there was really very little connection to him in the way that he was like giving me special teachings when the two of us were alone, for example.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So how do you end up resolving this?
I tried to convince my husband for many months, and he was not budging at all. And back in Arizona, my grandmother, her husband had died. It wasn't her legal husband. And she was now alone. And so I didn't mention this in the beginning, but like my grandmother was my greatest mentor, and it's probably because of her, I like had stability in my life mostly. So she was a huge part of my life. My grandmother's a Holocaust survivor. And so like survived the worst of the worst. And so she always had like the most positive, incredible attitude. And after her boyfriend, husband died, I knew that I had to go be with her. And so I had the excuse that I was going to leave. And so I told the leader, and everybody was accepting because like this person had died. I really had intentions to come back. I didn't know when or how long I was going to be gone, but I thought that I was going to come back. Like, what else was I going to do? I didn't have anything else waiting for me back in the US. So there wasn't anything to return to. But I also knew that I couldn't be with my husband anymore. So I knew that when I was leaving him. Like I wasn't leaving the leader and the community. I was leaving him because I couldn't continue. Yeah. So that was really how I was able to leave that marriage.
Wow. And may I ask, with your grandmother, was she, whose parent was she?
My mother's.
Okay. So presumably she is not a part of this community, but she was somewhere. Was she actually in Texas where you were able to see her every once in a while?
No, my mom's mom was in Arizona, where I was living with my mom during the school years, where I was going to public school. That's where my grandmother was. And being a single mom, my mom was going to work every day, and my grandmother would watch me in the mornings and after school. So my grandmother was really my primary caretaker. And I just do want to say that I kept my lives very secretive and separate. So I didn't tell my grandmother what happened to my dad's when I went to my dad's. So she wasn't aware of what was going on. I also didn't tell my mom. Like, both my mom and grandmother were not aware of all that was happening. They weren't aware of my marriage. They weren't aware of all of this that I was going through.
Did you actually have a sense that if you shared about it, that they would be upset? Or like in your young mentality and during these years, even kind of leading up to 20, what was your mentality around that? Was it that you were keeping a secret to protect something that was so amazing? Yeah. What was it?
Well, from the very beginning, I was told that I had to keep the secret of the community. So I was told by the community itself. After I got married to my husband, he told me that I had to keep the secret. So, and I was told specifically not to tell my mom and my grandmother. So that was in the back of my head. And so it was always there. And I mean, now, like when I look at it, or like maybe to the outside person listening, they're like, well, how could you not tell your mother? That seems so crazy. But it wasn't crazy at the time at all. I was a rule follower. So if somebody told me not to do something, I just didn't do it. I didn't even think about doing it. And everything was so confusing at my dad's house that I didn't even know I didn't have the words to express what was happening. It's like, how could I even tell my mom and my grandma that? That's like something that they couldn't even comprehend. It was so far from anything they had ever heard of. Like, I don't think that it just wasn't part of anything that they could have latched onto and like understood in a way. So I think that way. I also think, which I wouldn't have known this at the time, but I think I was completely ashamed. And it's not as if I wanted anybody to know this. It just seemed like the most horrible thing to have to tell somebody. And so I just think that I was so ashamed of this marriage. And I mean, I didn't talk about this marriage for years and years and years after it happened. Only recently have I been talking about it. So it was just a part of my life that after I left, I just kind of closed that book. And I didn't reopen it. It was like I wasn't even going to get into that. I just wanted to move on and to get on with my new life and to like experience new things. But I didn't want to go back to that portion of my life.
Yep. I get it. And I think this is the beauty of self-healing, that we really pay attention to ourselves and we do what our systems need. And sometimes it looks like tucking something away for years so that we can move on, feel successful in other ways, kind of get ourselves back to an extent that we're strong enough to then look at the stuff that's so painful.
Exactly.
And it does make complete sense to me also that knowing how important and how seriously the secrecy gets taken, it makes complete sense to me, actually, that you would be able to kind of function one way in one place and a different way in the other place. And you just divide and be who you are in that environment. And nobody even kind of knows the difference.
Yeah. Right.
We so hope that you enjoyed this episode. And please stay tuned for part of Leaving the Cult, the season 2 song written by Jaya Suri. And for all things related to Jaya, her music, ways that you can support her, check out the show notes.